The hatchling had already injured 3 handlers, burned 2 containment rigs, and reduced an entire training wing to smoldering wreckage before anyone finally admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. That this one was different, not just difficult, not just wild, but fundamentally unmanageable, and in a facility built to domesticate creatures far larger and far more dangerous, that was saying something. Alarms had become a constant background noise in the reinforced corridors. Scorch marks lined the walls like warnings written in fire, and every new handler assigned to the creature lasted less time than the one before, their confidence always dissolving into fear the moment they stepped too close to the enclosure, because the hatchling didn't just lash out. It reacted with precision, with intent, as if it understood exactly how to make them leave and exactly how to make sure they didn't come back. It was small for its kind, barely the size of a large dog, but that made it more unpredictable, not less, its movements quick and sharp, its wings still developing but strong enough to create bursts of force that knocked equipment off balance, and its fire, though not yet fully formed, was erratic and volatile, flaring in sudden, uncontrolled bursts that left no room for error, and at the center of all that chaos were its eyes, bright, alert, and constantly watching, tracking every movement, every shift in posture, every flicker of hesitation from the people who came too close. "They're going to put it down," one of the technicians whispered from behind the safety glass, her voice low as she watched the hatchling pace the enclosure again, its claws scraping faint lines into the reinforced floor. "They can't," another replied, though there was little conviction in his tone. "It's too valuable. Valuable doesn't matter if it can't be controlled." That was the problem. Control. Everything in the facility was built around it. Structured routines, calculated conditioning, precise behavioral reinforcement designed to turn instinct into obedience. But the hatchling rejected all of it, not with mindless aggression, but with something that looked disturbingly like understanding, as if it recognized the system being imposed on it and refused, outright, to accept it. Which was why, by the time Elias Mercer was called in, most of the staff had already given up. He wasn't a handler. That was the first thing people noticed. He didn't wear the standard reinforced gear, didn't carry the control implements or restraint tools that everyone else relied on, and when he walked into the observation room, hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets, his expression thoughtful rather than tense, it was immediately clear that he didn't see the situation the same way the others did. "That's it?" he asked, nodding toward the enclosure. "That's it," the lead technician confirmed. "It's driven off every handler we've assigned. We've tried conditioning, isolation, reward cycles, nothing works." Elias stepped closer to the glass, his gaze settling on the hatchling as it paused mid-step, its head snapping toward him instantly, its body going still in a way that suggested not calm, but focus. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias spoke. "You're not the problem, are you?" he murmured. The hatchling's wings twitched slightly. Behind him, one of the technicians frowned. "You're talking to it already?" Elias didn't look away. "It's already talking," he said. "That's not how." "It is," Elias interrupted gently. "Just not in a way you're listening for." The room fell quiet after that, because whether they agreed or not, there was something about the way he said it that made it difficult to dismiss entirely. "What's your plan?" the lead technician asked after a moment. Elias finally stepped back from the glass, glancing at the control panel briefly before looking back at the enclosure. "I'm going inside." The reaction was immediate. "No," the technician said sharply. "That's not happening. You've seen the reports." "Yeah," Elias replied. "I've read them." "Then you know what it can do." Elias nodded. "I do. And you still want to walk in there without protective gear?" He gave a small shrug. "Protective gear tells it I'm expecting a fight." "That's because you should be expecting a fight." Elias shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "That's the problem. Everyone who walks in there is already treating it like something they have to win against." He glanced back at the hatchling, which was still watching him with unwavering focus. "I'm not here to win." The technician stared at him for a long moment. "Then what are you here to do?" Elias's expression softened, just slightly. "I'm here to understand why it doesn't trust you." That answer didn't inspire confidence. But it did something else. It shifted the conversation. because no one else had framed the problem that way before. After a long pause and a series of reluctant checks and safeguards, the decision was made, not because they were convinced it would work, but because they had run out of alternatives, and as the containment doors slowly unlocked with a heavy mechanical hum, the tension in the room rose sharply, every eye fixed on Elias as he stepped forward. "Last chance to change your mind," the technician muttered. Elias didn't respond. He simply walked in. The doors sealed behind him with a heavy clang that echoed through the chamber. And just like that, it was only him and the hatchling. For a moment, nothing happened. The hatchling remained where it was, its body low, its wings slightly spread, its gaze locked onto him with an intensity that felt almost tangible. And Elias stopped a few steps inside, not advancing further, not retreating, simply standing. Waiting. "Hey!" he said quietly. The hatchling didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break that unwavering stare. Elias slowly lowered himself to one knee, making himself smaller, less imposing, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, and still. He did not reach for it, did not attempt to close the distance further. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. The hatchling's head tilted slightly, not in trust, but in curiosity. It was the first change. Small, but real. Elias noticed it immediately. "Yeah," he murmured. "You don't believe that yet." Behind the observation glass, no one spoke. No one moved, because something was happening. Not the kind of confrontation they expected. Something quieter. Something unfamiliar. The hatchling took a step forward, then stopped. Its claws scraped softly against the floor as it lowered its head slightly, testing, measuring, waiting for the reaction it had learned to expect. Elias didn't give it one. He stayed exactly where he was. Still, calm, present. Another step. Closer now. The air between them felt charged. Not with aggression, but with tension. The kind that came from uncertainty rather than hostility. And Elias kept his movements slow, his breathing steady, his gaze soft but focused, never breaking that fragile connection that had begun to form. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" he said quietly. The hatchling's wings shifted again, not flaring, not preparing to strike, but adjusting, as if it didn't quite know what to do with the situation it found itself in. For the first time since he had entered the enclosure, it did not attack, simply stood there. And in that moment, Elias understood something no one else had. This wasn't a creature that needed to be controlled. It was one that had never been given a reason to feel safe. And as he slowly reached into his pocket, not for a tool, not for a restraint, but for something far simpler, something no one in that facility would have thought to bring into an enclosure like this, he made a quiet decision. He wasn't going to train it. He was going to show it something it had never been offered before. Trust. Dragon. The moment Elias's hand moved, even slowly, even without threat, the hatchling reacted. Not with fire, not with a strike, but with a sudden tightening of its entire body, its wings lifting just slightly, its claws pressing into the ground as if bracing for something it had learned to expect. And that reaction alone told Elias more than any report ever could, because it wasn't aggression. It was anticipation, the kind that came from repeated patterns, from knowing that every movement a human made usually led to something unpleasant, something forceful, something that needed to be resisted or escaped. So he stopped. Immediately, his hand froze mid-motion, not pulling back, not continuing forward, simply holding still in the space between them, and for a few seconds nothing changed. The hatchling's gaze locked onto that unmoving hand, its body tense, waiting, counting almost, until the expected next step failed to come. Slowly, the tension shifted. Not gone, but altered. "Yeah," Elias murmured under his breath. "That's new, isn't it?" The hatchling blinked once. It was a small thing, but it mattered, because it meant the moment had broken from its pattern. Elias let his hand lower gradually, deliberately returning it to his side instead of reaching further, showing, without forcing, that he could choose not to act, that not every movement had to lead to escalation. And as he did, the hatchling's wings eased just slightly, not folding completely, but no longer held in that tight, defensive posture. Behind the observation glass, someone exhaled quietly. "It didn't attack," a technician whispered. as if saying it too loudly might undo whatever fragile balance had formed. Elias didn't look back. His focus remained entirely on the hatchling, on the subtle cues in its posture, its breathing, the way its head tilted just slightly as it tried to process something it clearly hadn't experienced before. "I'm going to try something," he said softly, though whether he meant the hatchling or the people watching, it wasn't entirely clear. This time, when his hand moved, it was slower, more deliberate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small strip of fabric, a ribbon, faded but clean, a soft, dull red that stood out sharply against the gray tones of the enclosure. And he held it loosely between his fingers, not presenting it as an object to be taken, not pushing it forward, just letting it exist in the space where the hatchling could see it. The reaction was immediate. The hatchling's gaze snapped to the ribbon, its focus intense, but not in the same way it had watched tools or restraints before. This was different, uncertain, curious rather than defensive, and Elias remained still, allowing that curiosity to take its time, not rushing it, not turning the moment into something it would feel pressured to respond to. "This isn't a trap," he said quietly. "It's just something different." The hatchling took a step closer, then stopped. Its nose twitched slightly, the faintest movement, as if it were testing the air, trying to understand what this new variable meant, and Elias resisted the urge to move, to encourage, to guide, because he knew, instinctively, that this moment had to belong entirely to the creature in front of him. Choice. That was what it had never been given. Until now. Another step. Closer. The distance between them was no longer wide, no longer filled with tension that felt insurmountable, but it was still delicate, still uncertain, still balanced on the edge of something that could either build or collapse depending on what happened next. Elias slowly lowered his hand, placing the ribbon gently on the ground between them, then pulling his hand back just enough to create space. Not withdrawing completely, not abandoning the interaction, but removing the pressure of proximity. "There," he said softly. "No tricks." The hatchling's eyes flicked from the ribbon to Elias, then back again. Its body shifted slightly, one claw lifting before setting down again as it hesitated, caught between instinct and curiosity, between what it had learned and what it was now experiencing, and for a moment, it seemed as though it might retreat, as though the uncertainty might push it back into the familiar pattern of avoidance. But it didn't. Slowly, carefully, it leaned forward, its head lowering, its movements cautious but intentional, and as it drew closer to the ribbon, its wings adjusted again, not in defense this time, but in balance, as if it were preparing not for attack, but for contact. Elias held his breath. Not visibly, but internally, because this was it. The moment that would decide whether everything he had done so far had actually meant something. The hatchling reached the ribbon, paused, and then, very gently, nudged it with the tip of its snout. No fire, no strike, just contact. A quiet ripple passed through the observation room behind the glass. A collective reaction that no one dared to voice out loud, because what they were witnessing wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. The hatchling pulled back slightly after the touch, watching for a reaction, waiting for the hidden consequence that had always followed contact before, but nothing happened. Elias didn't move, didn't reach, didn't speak immediately. He let the moment breathe, let the hatchling process it fully, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in its body began to ease. It nudged the ribbon again, this time with a little more confidence. Then, after a brief pause, it did something no one in that facility had ever seen it do. Picked it up, gently, carefully, holding the soft strip of fabric between its small, sharp teeth in a way that suggested not possession, but curiosity. Elias let out a quiet breath, a faint smile touching his expression. "Yeah," he murmured, "that's yours." The hatchling's gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time since it had been brought into that facility, there was no hostility in it, no calculation, no immediate expectation of conflict, just attention, present, open, and something else, something new. Trust, small, fragile, barely formed, but real. Elias shifted slightly then, very slowly raising his hand again, but this time the movement was different. Not approaching the hatchling directly, not reaching into its space, but simply resting his hand against the ground, closer than before but still allowing distance, still giving the creature the option to engage or withdraw. The hatchling watched him, then looked at the ribbon, then back at him, and after a long moment, took a step closer. Not toward the ribbon, but toward him. The room beyond the glass fell completely silent. Because this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Not obedience, not control, but connection. And as the hatchling closed the final gap, lowering its head just slightly, not in submission, not in fear, but in something that resembled cautious acceptance, Elias understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about training. It never had been. It was about showing a creature that had been pushed, restrained, and misunderstood its entire life, that it could choose something different. And that maybe, just maybe, so could they. Dragon. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. But once the hatchling took that first voluntary step toward Elias, something fundamental changed in the air between them, something the observers behind the reinforced glass could feel even if they couldn't quite explain it. Because what they were witnessing wasn't control being established or dominance being asserted. It was something far more fragile and far more powerful, the slow and uncertain formation of trust where none had existed before, and that kind of change didn't move in leaps. It moved in moments, small and deliberate, each one building carefully on the last. Elias didn't rush it. That was the difference. Where every handler before him had seen progress as something to be measured in immediate compliance. Closer proximity, reduced aggression, faster response. Elias treated it like something that needed space to breathe, something that would collapse if forced too quickly. And so when the hatchling stepped closer, he didn't reach for it, didn't try to take advantage of the opening. He simply stayed where he was, his hand resting lightly against the ground. His posture open but non-threatening, his gaze steady but soft. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. The hatchling tilted its head slightly, the ribbon still held loosely between its teeth, its eyes studying him with that same sharp awareness. But now, there was something else layered beneath it, something that hadn't been there before. Curiosity. Not the cautious, defensive curiosity of something preparing for danger, but the genuine kind, the kind that asked questions instead of bracing for answers. It took another step forward. Closer now. Close enough that Elias could see the fine details of its scales, the subtle variations in color that caught the low industrial lighting in shifting tones of deep blue and charcoal, the faint tremor in its wings as it adjusted its balance, still growing, still learning how to exist in its own body, and for a moment, the enormity of it all settled over him. Not just what this creature was, but what it had endured. "You're not broken," he murmured. "You've just been treated like you are." Behind the glass, a technician shifted uncomfortably. Because that statement didn't just apply to the hatchling. It applied to everything they had done. The hatchling moved again, slowly lowering its head as it stepped into the space just within Elias's reach, but still. He didn't move to close that distance. He let the hatchling decide what came next, let it control the interaction in a way it had never been allowed to before, and after a long moment of stillness, of quiet observation and careful breathing, the hatchling nudged his hand. Lightly, testing. The contact was brief, almost hesitant, as if it expected the moment to trigger something sudden and unpleasant. But when nothing happened, when Elias didn't grab, didn't restrain, didn't even shift too quickly, the hatchling lingered just a fraction longer the second time, its touch a little more certain, a little less guarded. Elias let out a slow breath. "That's it," he said softly. "You set the pace." The ribbon slipped from the hatchling's mouth, falling gently to the ground between them, forgotten for the moment as its attention focused entirely on this new kind of interaction. This unfamiliar exchange that didn't follow any of the patterns it had learned to defend against. And for a while, that was all there was. Small movements, brief touches, pauses filled with quiet understanding instead of tension. Time passed. No one in the observation room could say how much, because no one dared to interrupt it. Eventually, Elias shifted slightly, not away but forward, just enough to test the next step. Just enough to ask a silent question rather than impose an action, and the hatchling noticed immediately, its body stilling for a brief moment before relaxing again when it realized the movement carried no threat. "I'm going to try something," Elias said quietly. This time, when he raised his hand, it was toward the hatchling. Not quickly, not directly, but slowly enough that the creature could track every inch of movement, could choose at any moment to pull away if it felt unsafe, and for a heartbeat, The old tension flickered back into its posture, a reflex more than a decision, but it didn't retreat. It stayed, watched, waited. Elias's hand stopped just short of contact. He held it there, letting the hatchling close the final distance if it wanted to. For a moment, didn't. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it leaned forward, and this time, pressed its head into his hand. The reaction in the observation room was immediate, though still silent, a collective intake of breath, a shared recognition that something extraordinary had just happened, because that single, simple gesture carried more meaning than any controlled response ever could. It wasn't trained, it wasn't conditioned, it wasn't forced. It was chosen. Elias's fingers moved gently, carefully, brushing along the smooth surface of the hatchling's scales. His touch light, respectful, never gripping, never holding, just present, and the hatchling responded with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, something low and quiet that vibrated faintly through its chest. A sound that no one in that facility had ever heard from it before. Not a warning, not a threat, something else entirely. Contentment. "There you are," Elias whispered. The hatchling's wings settled more fully against its sides, its posture loosening in a way that transformed its entire presence, making it look less like a volatile threat and more like what it truly was. A young creature, still learning, still searching for something it could trust. But the moment didn't last forever. Couldn't. Because just as the tension had once built slowly, so too did the outside world begin to press back in. A faint sound echoed through the facility. Distant at first, but unmistakable. An alarm, different from the others. Sharper, more urgent. Elias's head lifted slightly, his attention shifting just enough to register it, and the hatchling noticed immediately, its body tensing again, its instincts reacting to the sudden change in atmosphere, the disruption of the fragile calm they had built. Behind the glass, technicians scrambled, voices rising in hushed but urgent tones. "What is that?" "External breach warning, Sector 3. That's not possible, everything's." A second alarm cut through the first. Louder, closer. Elias's expression shifted. Not into panic, but into focus, his hand remaining steady against the hatchling as he spoke softly. "Hey, it's okay," he murmured. "Just noise." But the hatchling wasn't convinced. Its wings flared slightly, its body lowering again, the old instincts pushing back to the surface, ready to react, ready to defend, and Elias knew, instinctively, that whatever was happening beyond those walls, whatever had triggered the alarms, it was about to test everything they had just built. "Elias!" A voice crackled through the intercom, tight with urgency. "We need you to exit the enclosure immediately." He didn't move. His gaze remained on the hatchling. "It'll panic if I leave now," he replied calmly. "Protocol." "Forget protocol," Elias said, his tone firm but not raised. "Tell me what's happening." There was a brief pause. Then, "Containment failure in a neighboring wing," the voice admitted. "One of the larger specimens has broken restraint." The words settled heavily in the air, because that changed everything. A hatchling was one thing, a fully grown dragon. Uncontrolled, agitated, loose within the facility, was something else entirely. The hatchling sensed it. Even without understanding the words, it felt the shift, the rising tension, the distant vibrations that carried through the reinforced structure, and its reaction was immediate. Its body tightening, its gaze darting toward the enclosure doors, toward the source of the disturbance. Elias exhaled slowly. "Hey!" he said softly, drawing its attention back to him. The hatchling hesitated, looked at him, at his hand, at the calm he was trying to hold in place despite everything else unraveling around them. And in that moment, Elias realized something. This wasn't just about earning its trust anymore. It was about keeping it, because whatever came next would either prove that trust was real or shatter it completely. Dragon. The alarms didn't stop. They intensified, layering over each other in sharp, discordant waves that echoed through the facility like a warning no one could ignore, and the distant tremor that followed them was unmistakable now. A heavy, rhythmic vibration that carried through the reinforced flooring, through the walls, through the very air itself, signaling something massive moving far too freely where it should have been contained. And inside the enclosure, the hatchling felt every bit of it, its body tightening again, wings half spread, instincts screaming louder than the fragile calm Elias had worked so carefully to build. "It's all right," Elias said softly, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the sealed doors, calculating, listening, measuring the distance of the approaching threat. "I'm still here." The hatchling's gaze snapped back to him, uncertain, torn between the growing panic in its instincts and the unfamiliar sense of steadiness his presence offered. And for a moment, it wavered, caught between two worlds, one shaped by fear, the other by trust that had only just begun to form. A heavy impact reverberated somewhere beyond the enclosure walls. Closer now. Too close. "Elias!" The voice over the intercom returned, sharper this time. "You need to get out of there now." He didn't move, because leaving now would undo everything. Because if he ran, if he showed fear, if he abandoned the space they had created together, the hatchling wouldn't just lose trust in him. It would lose trust in the possibility of trust itself. "No," he said quietly. "That's not a suggestion." "It is to me," Elias replied, calm but immovable. "Open the secondary access behind me." "What? Why would we?" "Because if that thing breaches this wing," Elias cut in, his voice tightening just slightly, "I'm not letting this one face it alone in a sealed box." There was hesitation on the other end. Protocol screamed against the idea. But the situation had already gone far beyond protocol. Another impact. This time, the wall to the far side of the enclosure groaned faintly under the stress, fine dust sifting down from the seams of reinforced panels, and the hatchling reacted instantly, a sharp, frightened sound escaping it as it backed away from the noise, its wings flaring fully now, not in aggression but in fear. Elias turned back to it immediately. "Hey, hey!" he said, lowering himself again, grounding his posture, bringing himself back into its line of focus. "Stay with me." The hatchling's breathing was faster now, uneven, its eyes darting again toward the source of the disturbance, its instincts pushing it toward panic, toward reaction, toward the kind of explosive defense that had defined its behavior until now. But Elias didn't let that happen. Not by force, by presence. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice steady, unwavering despite the chaos building around them. "Whatever that is, we deal with it together." The words meant nothing in language, but everything in tone, in consistency, in truth. The hatchling hesitated. Then slowly, it moved back toward him. Not all the way, but enough. Enough to show that something had held. That something hadn't broken. A sharp crack split the air. The wall to their right buckled inward slightly, metal groaning as something massive struck it from the other side. And this time, the hatchling couldn't hold back, a burst of raw, uncontrolled flame erupting from its mouth. Not directed, not targeted, just a reflexive release of fear and energy that scorched the ground between them. Elias didn't flinch, didn't retreat. He stayed exactly where he was. "It's okay," he said again, softer this time, slower. "You're okay." The hatchling's breathing hitched. His fire faded. His body still trembled, but it didn't lash out again. Because he hadn't reacted the way everything else in its life had taught it to expect. Another impact. This one louder, closer. And then, the wall gave way. Not completely, but enough. A section of reinforced plating tore inward under the force of something far larger than the hatchling. Something that didn't hesitate, didn't test, didn't wait, and through the fractured opening, a massive shape forced its way forward, scales darkened with stress, eyes burning with agitation, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, the sheer size of it enough to make the enclosure feel suddenly far too small. A full-grown dragon, unrestrained, unstable, and very, very close. The hatchling froze, its entire body locking in place, its instincts overwhelmed not just by fear, but by recognition, something deeper, something instinctual that told it exactly what it was facing. Elias felt it too. The shift, the weight of something ancient and powerful pressing into the space they occupied. Behind him, a section of the wall slid open, the secondary access he had demanded, revealing a narrow exit corridor, a clear path out. "Elias, move!" the intercom voice urged. "Get out now." He didn't, because the hatchling hadn't, and it wouldn't, not on its own. If he ran now, it would be left behind, alone, again. Elias stepped forward instead, not toward the exit, toward the hatchling. And then, without hesitation, he did something no one in that facility would have believed possible even moments ago. He stepped in front of it, positioning himself between the small, trembling creature and the massive, advancing threat tearing its way through the enclosure wall. The larger dragon's gaze locked onto him instantly. A human, standing in its path, unarmored, unafraid, or at least appearing not to be. Elias didn't move, didn't raise a weapon, didn't shout. He simply stood there, his presence steady, his body language clear. Not a challenge, not aggression, but a barrier. A line. "You're not taking this one," he said quietly. The dragon exhaled a low, rumbling sound, heat curling faintly at the edges of its jaws, its agitation clear, its focus shifting between the human in front of it and the smaller creature behind him. The hatchling pressed closer, not forward, but into Elias's back, instinctively, seeking cover, seeking safety, seeking him. And in that moment, everything changed, because this wasn't just about calming a frightened creature anymore. This was about protecting it. The dragon took a step forward. The ground trembled beneath the weight of it. And Elias did not move, did not yield. The air between them grew hotter, heavier, charged with the kind of tension that came just before something irreversible. Elias! He ignored it, because there was only one thing that mattered now. He reached back slowly, carefully, his hand brushing lightly against the hatchling behind him, grounding it, reminding it that it wasn't alone, that it wasn't about to be abandoned like everything else in its short, difficult life. "It's okay," he murmured, not taking his eyes off the larger dragon. "I've got you." The hatchling stilled, not completely calm, not without fear, but anchored, because he was still there. The larger dragon hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough, because something about the scene in front of it didn't fit, didn't match the patterns of dominance and submission, of fear and reaction, that it understood. A human, shielding one of its own, not as prey, not as master, but as protector. The moment stretched, tight, fragile, balanced on the edge of something no one could predict. And Elias made a choice, not based on protocol, not based on fear, but on the same principle that had brought him into that enclosure in the first place. Trust. He slowly lowered himself to one knee again, not in surrender, but in something far more deliberate. He made himself smaller, less threatening, less confrontational, even with the massive dragon looming just ahead. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly. The dragon's gaze sharpened, its head lowering slightly, its focus narrowing, as if trying to understand something it had never been presented with before. Silence followed, heavy, uncertain, and then, the heat in the air began to fade. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the tension to shift. Enough for the moment to break away from the edge of violence. Behind Elias, the hatchling leaned into him just slightly, the faintest pressure against his back. A silent, instinctive gesture that spoke louder than anything else in that room. Trust. Not fragile anymore. Not tentative. But real. Earned. And in that moment, with a human standing unarmed before a dragon that could end him in seconds, and choosing not to run, Elias Mercer became something no one in that facility had ever seen before. Not a handler. Not a trainer. Not a controller. But something far rarer. Someone a dragon could believe in. Dragon.